Alright guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to discuss the personal defense weapon concept yet again. Now, longtime viewers of the channel might remember that I previously did a video covering the personal defense weapon concept throughout history. That was a very large, expansive overview on a very interesting weapons classification. This video is going to look more closely at that weapons classification and what constitutes a PDW, and look at that more closely, because there's a lot of guns calling themselves PDW that have a wide variety of feature sets, chamberings, materials, all this kind of stuff, and it can be a little bit confusing to look at it because we have a tendency to look at a definition and consider that to be law, but it would appear that that is not necessarily the case. So first off, we should probably define what a personal defense weapon is. A personal defense weapon is a weapon used by a non-frontline soldier. So somebody who has a task other than just destroying the enemy through combined small arms fire. So when we talk about overall combined arms doctrine, the people who are accountable for the direct fire, shoot, move, communicate aspect of land warfare. So the guys that are running around out there with M4 carbines and M240 Bravos, and they're laying down suppressive fire, and they're conducting battle drill 1 alpha and all that kind of stuff, those guys, those are your main frontline infantry. What we're talking about are all the people that support the main frontline infantry, the massive mechanism that keeps them moving forward. So that being artillerymen, that being tankers, and everyone else on the battlefield who's still really close to the battle, but doesn't necessarily need a full-size rifle. And that's how that has been broken down over history. So take a medic, for example. Medics already got to carry all of their life-saving stuff. They're not necessarily responsible for maneuvering against and destroying the enemy. They're supposed to be taking care of the aftermath of that, the guys that get wounded and all that kind of stuff. But that doesn't mean that a medic doesn't need to have a gun at all, because the medic needs to not only defend themselves, because they have a right to self-defense, but they also need to defend the wounded. But in order to defend the wounded, they don't necessarily need the same capabilities as a full-sized infantry rifle to be able to gauge out to the same distances that the infantry are expected to do so. They need a closer range weapon in order to be able to defend themselves and the wounded. This is the same for a lot of these other people. When you're talking about tankers are supposed to be in a tank. So if tankers ain't tanking, they're not supposed to be infantry. But they might need to abandon a tank. They might need to fight their way to a tank given different situations and stuff like that. So they're going to need some type of weapon system that doesn't necessarily have all of the same capabilities as a full-size rifle in order to be able to get to that tank or get away from that tank, given whatever the circumstances are. Radio operators, artillerymen, if you're sitting there Johnny Cannon Conquer, a couple K behind the line, sending rounds down range, and all of a sudden there's a breakthrough and the enemy is now in your backyard. It's not expected that you're going to fight them as though you were infantry. It's going to expect that you're going to fight them long enough for you to be able to break contact and get to where it is that you need to be. Now, the most classic example of a PDW is the M1 Carbine, which we have this Plainfield manufacturing M1 Carbine, previously reviewed on the channel, link in the description. This was the first successful application of the PDW weapons, the PDW concept, and then we would see it begin to develop and change throughout history. With that development and change throughout history and all that kind of stuff, we've seen a lot of things get entered into this category. We've seen the Car-15. Okay, it's still running it's now running the same cartridges as everyone else was, because the M1 Carbine ran off the .30 carbine, whereas the primary infantry rifle at the time was the M1 Garand, which fired the .30-06. We get into Vietnam, we had the M16, and we see some use of the Car-15 or M16 carbines and all that kind of stuff. However, they were not necessarily mass issued. It was decided that the M16 was light enough that it wasn't that much of a detriment for everyone to have an M16. That would change as time would go on, and we would get closer to the M16A2, we'd start to see the M4 come along. But both the Car-15 or M16 carbines and the M4 are chambered in the same cartridge as the M16, so the 5.56 cartridge. And that was something that, when we first see PDWs come online, hey, in order to be able to achieve this shorter range thing, we don't necessarily need a full power rifle cartridge, we can go with the more early version of the intermediate cartridge, even though the .30 carbine was referred to as a pistol cartridge in its heyday. It's technically not a pistol cartridge. It is more indicative of a rifle cartridge. Just a very light one, an intermediate cartridge. So the M4 would become the new PDW. So it would be issued out to, radio operators, medics, and squad leaders, and all that kind of stuff. And this was something that prior to PDWs, you would see the same type of thing utilized with SMGs. So the MP40 would go to people who weren't necessarily expected to do frontline fighting or were supposed to be giving orders to people who were doing frontline fighting. But it would also go to like tankers and stuff like that, because Mauser 98 carbine doesn't really, or 98K carabiner doesn't really fit into a tank all that well, but an MP40 does with its folding stock and all this kind of stuff. We would see this same type of thing come in with the MP5, where the MP5 would get issued to air crews because they definitely don't necessarily need a full-size rifle. They need the most compact thing they can have, and an MP5 and chambered in 9mm kind of meets that form factor. And this is where we start to get like the MP5K PDW. It's right there in the name. This is called a PDW, yet it doesn't share any of the other features that we've discussed thus far with the PDW. And then you get into the 90s with the FNP 90 versus the MP7 from HK. These were both designed to be PDWs. These were supposed to go to personnel with non-frontline combat duties or not necessarily fight the enemy combat duties, so that they would have something compact, lightweight, with a high capacity, but chambered in a pistol cartridge that could handle body armor. So have some rifle type characteristics or rifle type performance, but at very much closer distances. So this really starts to beg the question of what constitutes a PDW? Is it barrel length? Does it have to be something that has a super short barrel? But if we look at the M1 carbine, that barrel's not that short. Okay, well, is it chambering? Does it have to be in a rifle or intermediate cartridge? Well, apparently not, because we have the MP5K PDW. We have the 5.7mm cartridge in existence. And these are examples with the P90, with the 4.6 and the MP7 of PDWs chambered in pistol cartridges. Okay, so if it's not that, is it weight? Well, I think weight might be a very, very common determining factor here, but I don't necessarily think that weight alone is what constitutes a PDW. That becomes a very sticky position to be in at that point. Okay, Murph, so what's the answer in this case? What makes something a PDW? If we go with the true doctrinal answer, because we are talking about military arms, the only people who can really designate something as a PDW is the military, because the pinnacle part of this definition is that it goes to non-frontline combat personnel or personnel not involved in direct fighting duties. And you only really get that in the military. You could maybe try to spin it to where it applies to like police in the terms of like a SWAT team. So if a SWAT team has a paramedic tagging along, well, that guy's not SWAT. But he's still pretty close to what it is that SWAT's doing. So he might have a particular type of weapon system in order to better accommodate both him being able to do paramedic stuff, but also defend himself should he find himself in that type of situation, or defend his wounded should he find himself in that type of situation. But it's truly the military that determines what is a PDW. And as much as they like to, the military at large like to speak in doctrinal terms and definitions and all that kind of stuff, those definitions are incredibly fluid, surprisingly so, as it would turn out. So really, anything could be a PDW if the military determines it to be so. I would say one of the crucial factors of a PDW is that it's not chambered in a full power rifle cartridge. But technically, if the military wanted to take a AR-10 and give it a little bit shorter barrel than what you would commonly find on the civilian side. So let's say like a 13-inch barrel and a side folding stock and call it a PDW, they could do it if they're giving it to personnel who are close to the fighting but aren't directly involved in the fighting. It becomes a PDW at that point. Which is funny because then a PDW can also very quickly become the main frontline arm, because we saw that during the GWOT. We went into the Global War on Terror using the M16A2 as the primary military arm for the Army and the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps held on to the M16A4 much longer. However, the Army would go to the M4 eventually, just based off of what it was that they were actually doing once they got into sustainment operations. So they were doing house-to-house fighting in like Fallujah, or they were riding around in trucks all the time and all that kind of stuff. And an M16 is not very portable inside of a truck. It's actually kind of a hindrance, whereas an M4 is pretty convenient. And even as some aspects of the war would not necessarily facilitate the M4 being the best option, specifically in the south of Afghanistan, where engagements could be out to 500 meters, sure, you can shoot an M4 out to 500 meters, but it's a lot easier with something that's actually built to do it, which the M4 was never really intended to live out at 500 meters. It was more like something that you could do should the situation arise, but the situation does not arise that consistently, you would then switch to something else. And this is where you see the return of the DMR. We're not going to get into that. We're getting down a little bit of a rabbit hole here. So the military can identify anything it is that it wants to be, whatever it is that it wants to be, because it can change the definition whenever it wants. I think a fantastic example of this, and this is getting down a rabbit hole, but at least it's germane to the topic at hand. The military is adopting a new tracked vehicle that's supposed to be more or less replacing the Stryker. And it is the M10 Booker, which has tracks, which has a turret, which has a 105mm gun. It can fire on the move and all that kind of stuff. It has all of these features that we would classically associate with a tank. And a lot of the top brass in the military may colloquially refer to it as a tank. However, in military parlance, an actual definition, doctrinal definition, it is not a tank. It is an armored vehicle or something like that. It is not considered to be a tank, because the military did away with designations like light and medium tanks decades ago, before I was born. And apparently has no interest in reintroducing those definitions. So they would prefer to refer to what is ostensibly a light tank as just an armored vehicle. And the whole purpose being is that it's not necessarily supposed to fight tanks. It's just supposed to support the infantry, which tanks can do that in two ways. They can fight other tanks. They can protect infantry through their armored hulls and then also their machine guns, and then they can also destroy enemy hardpoints. So I guess in this case, the M10 is probably being looked at more for destroying enemy hardpoints and being able to fight tanks should it need to. But that's not like, no one's going to sit there and be like, all right, that platoon of M10s over there, they're going to go up against those T-72s. It's probably not going to end very well. But you could do it if you had to in a pinch. Same type of thing with a PDW. If you had to fight on the front line with a PDW, you could. You're just not supposed to live there when you do it. And that's kind of a common theme throughout. Okay, so in that case, Murph, if the only thing that makes a PDW is the fact that the government calls it a PDW, then why are we even having this conversation today? Well, because first off, I find it very interesting. I enjoy talking about these sort of like contextual and conceptual type things, but what do I think makes for a good PDW? If you were someone who was in the position to make these types of decisions, what would you want to be looking at? Because, of course, if we talk about within our own equipment, I'm not going to war on my personal time, so I don't meet even the classic definition of a PDW for any of my firearms. But in concept and how my mind works, I enjoy small, compact weapon systems, and I think that's what constitutes a PDW. So let me go into that a little bit further. A PDW should be short. It should be shorter than what we would consider commonly to be a rifle length, so below 16 inches. If we're talking about it in a civilian definition sense, it should be less than 16 inches. And I think that's pretty well supported by a lot of the distinctions that the military has made thus far. In my opinion, lightweight should be the primary focus. You want it to be something that's light. You want it to be something that's handy, because that person, or you in this case, if say you've got like a squad of guys, you've got your little end of the world agreement and all that kind of stuff. If the country falls into disorder, you guys are in a group together. That's important. It's important to have community like that, because one guy on his own cannot resist many. But you're going to want something lightweight, because you're going to be carrying a whole bunch of other gear around, and you're going to want your rifle, while you want it to be worth something, it needs to not be a hindrance to you and the rest of the team. In my opinion, it should be chambered in a rifle cartridge, because I would much rather fight with a rifle than a handgun cartridge pretty much any day of the week. If you got to go with a handgun cartridge, I think it's very important to recognize that you're really limiting the range in which you can engage. in that kind of optimal PDW engagement area, I would consider to be 0 to 200 meters. So if you are going to go with the pistol cartridge, you want something that you can engage out to 200 meters with, and that's kind of pushing it with 9mm. But it's been shown time and again that with 5.7, and I'm sure with 4.6, out of the P90 and MP7 respectively, that you would be able to engage out to those distances. You may not necessarily have the most body armor penetrating capability at those distances, but you'll still be able to put hits on a target, and sometimes that matters more than anything else. So weight, cartridge, and length. Those are the things that I think that are the most important attributes of a PDW. So what are things in my collection that constitute kind of the best of PDWs? My 300 Blackout SBR that I've affectionately termed my Splenda Gerbil, which has been updated, which has been reviewed and update reviewed in the channel, links in the description, is a pretty good example. It's a little heavy, but it's definitely very short, and it's chambered in 300 Blackout, so I have a full power rifle cartridge. Now, for a lot of people, especially since this is kind of like my version, my concept of the Splenda, this is the Splenda Gerbil of the Honey Badger. The Honey Badger was built to replace an MP5 SD. An MP5 SD is not a PDW. That is a purpose-built offensive weapon system for a very specific set of circumstances. So kind of like a Mark 18. A Mark 18 is technically not a PDW either. That is a purpose-built CQB rifle. Same kind of thing with an MP5 SD. That's built for very clandestine CQB, as opposed to, what a PDW would commonly be used for. And at some point, I'm going to pop a suppressor on here, and I think that segues this away from being a PDW. In addition to that, since I am speaking in the sense of, a civilian in this case, I guess we'd say, or at least talking to other civilians in this case, this is an SBR. This is a fantastic truck gun. Now, a truck gun might have a lot of features and attributes that are very similar to a PDW, but again, since we're not speaking in the military sense right now, not a PDW, which if you're interested in my truck gun concept, go ahead and check out the link in the description. And then we also have my 9mm SBR, built on an Aero Precision ECP lower. So, yes, I am not the biggest fan of handgun cartridges in this type of chambering. However, again, if we're talking about employing this from within a vehicle, on like a helicopter or something along those lines, a 9mm makes sense. If an air crew goes down, they're fighting insanely close. They don't necessarily need to reach out and touch someone. And with the right amount of practice, you can reach a 9mm out to 200 yards, especially when you're talking about out of something with this barrel length. So, an MP5, any other, CZ Scorpion, any other type of like 9mm carbine and stuff like that would be applicable in this case, given a very specific set of circumstances. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you got something out of it. And that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.